This unit we talked about sub-Saharan Africa. That's everything south of the Sahara Desert. We talked about North Africa when we talked about the Middle East and Southwest Asia because they have a lot of common cultural features. So first being their ethnicity. Most people in Northern Africa are of Arab descent. Many of them are also Muslim practitioners of Islam. The climate differences and the fact that we have a different biome with the desert also separates them. And these are some of the countries that have access to oil as well. Where sub-Saharan Africa is a little different, right? So most of this region is practitioners of either their natural religions through animism or Christianity due to Christian missionaries. And also we have grasslands, we have rainforest, and the different biomes really separates the continent into two. All right, let's talk about where people live in Africa. We have a population density map at the bottom, so let's talk about that and just work on interpreting maps. If you're just listening to the audio of this, go ahead and look down at the screen if you've been struggling with map interpretation. Let's circle in red the areas where we have more people living. So if we're looking at the population density map, the darker the color, let's look at the legend, darker the color, the more people that live there. Okay, so we have a couple key places to look at. We have one here. So there's lots of places where we can see a higher concentration. This one's pretty apparent right here, right? So if you remember, this is where the Nile River is, and so you can see that dependence on the river there. We also have the Niger River over in this region, and other access to fresh water like around Lake Victoria. So let's look at the places with lower population densities. We'll use black for that one. Please note that there's even less than 2 people per square mile in these areas. Okay. So our major area with low population density is the Sahara, of course. So very low population density, and that same similar climate is again what connects it to Southwest Asia. And then we also have another desert down here. You should remember that from your map, but that's the Kalahari Desert. Both of those places have low population densities where the water is scarce. The other places we see are places with cities, right? So where there's more cities, we have more people living. All right, so again, population pyramids are not going away. We've got a couple things to look at here if we want to practice with these. If you continually have issues with these on the test, again, let's look through some of these. So there's a couple of questions on here. It says, what stage of growth are these population pyramids in? How developed are these countries? And what does each location need provided for them? All right, so the first thing I want to look at is this comparison between West Africa and Western Europe at the bottom. Remember that on population pyramids, we always look at the bottom of the population pyramid to figure out what's going on, because that's where the birth rate is, right? So our younger age groups are at the bottom, so that's where the birth rate is. So if we're looking at the bottom here in West Africa as a region, we can see that slope that shows that it's rapidly growing, right? This is a rapid growth population. This is in stage 2. So, and here we've got it broken down with sub-Saharan Africa off to the right, and same thing, rapidly growing population. We do have some people living a little bit longer, but it's got that, that triangular slope. In slow growth, we tend to see kind of a leveling out in slow growth. If you look right here, where the last 3 or 4 are pretty solid and haven't changed much, and then we have negative growth where you start to see that slope like we have in Western Europe. We don't see this in Africa. There's very few places in Africa that are this developed, where you've got large amounts of people living longer and having this low birth rate. So generally speaking, in sub-Saharan Africa, your biggest population is going to be your youth. What do youth need? They need schools. We need daycare facilities, childcare. So if the government's going to look at this, right, if a government's using a population pyramid to solve a problem, they're going to look at these and say, we need more schools. There's more and more kids being born. All right, so here's our plate boundaries. I know y'all know what they are, but maybe you don't remember the physical features that are created with each of them. So we have divergent, convergent, and transform. Convergent creates those mountains as those plates come together. You get the mountains that form. Transform is where we get our earthquakes because they're going back and forth against each other, and it causes them to get stuck and knock the plates up, which causes those earthquakes or tsunamis if it happens underwater. Divergent is what we have here in East Africa. So this divergent plate boundary, you can see it was on your physical map. It's in the dashed line here, and this is a plate boundary. This area is called the Great Rift Valley. So this area is got that divergent boundary, and it is spreading apart, creating this big valleys within Eastern Africa. All right, so we have many different biomes in Africa because of that we have many different climates. We'll look at climate graphs on the next slide. But in North Africa, where we have the Sahara, it's arid, which means dry and hot, mostly year-round. In Central Africa, right along the equator, we would have an equatorial forest. It is a tropical biome. We have a rainforest. It is hot and it's raining all year. And in Southern Africa, as we get closer to the Kalahari, we have drier temperatures, so we don't see as many trees. It does rain enough to create some grasslands, but it's a more mild climate, it's more temperate. So let's talk about some climate graphs. Again, I feel like we're still having issues with these on the test, so let's look through some of them. Remember that a bar is always the precipitation. The way that you can remember that, the way I tell my students, is that as water collects on the ground, it piles up, right? So a bar graph is starting from the bottom of the graph going up. So you can think about it like water settling, right? Or like a rain gauge, if any of you have a rain gauge to see how much rain falls. The line graph is always the temperature. So you feel the temperature in the air. When you walk outside, you get a gust of air, whether it's hot or cold. You feel it in the air. So maybe that will help you remember that the line graph is for temperature. So we have two different ones here. The first one is in Algeria. Even if you don't know where Algeria is, just let's interpret the climate graph. So I know we're in millimeters and in centigrade here, or Celsius, but that's okay. We don't need that. What we do need to be able to do is see patterns. So the first thing I can see is that it's cooler during some parts of the year, and it gets warmer in the summer, and then goes back down, right? I also know that this is in the northern hemisphere because it slopes up like ours does, right? The hottest months are June, July, and August. So I know that it gets hot during the middle of the year and it's cooler towards the end. I can also see the precipitation. Even if I don't know how much millimeters are, there's nothing, right? There's very little bit happening there. So I know that this is probably a desert. I might be confused because I wouldn't think it gets that cold in the desert, but it has to be based on the precipitation. Looking to the right, we have another one in Kenya. You may know that Kenya is closer to Lake Victoria, and maybe not, but we see something very different on this population pyramid. The first thing I'm going to notice is this straight line with this temperature, right? So the temperature stays almost constant throughout the year, and the slope when it gets cooler is, look, in June, July, and August. So I now know this has to be the southern hemisphere, right? You can't have summer be colder months, right? So this must be their winter. So I know that this may be, even though it's just a little bit, we know that this has to be right below the equator, just south of the equator. And then I see varying temperatures, or precipitation throughout the year. So this is definitely not a desert. This one's a little bit easier because we are in inches and in Fahrenheit, but it rains throughout the year, and rains some pretty significant amounts in April and May. So I know that this one probably can support more life, can have more trees, have more arable land, and that temperature stays pretty consistent throughout the year. Okay, so much of the political history that we discussed, at least in this class, is based on the imperialism of the European countries on Africa. So let's start by talking about the Berlin Conference. The Berlin Conference, even if you don't remember that time or that event, happened in the late 1800s, and that's when European countries came together and they put out a map and they decided to keep themselves from arguing and fighting and going to war in Africa. They sat down diplomatically and tried to divide up Africa. African leaders were not invited to come to this meeting. It was clearly done by these colonial powers. It was to split up Africa. Economically, It took their resources, their money. Obviously, the slave trade as well was part of this, and so with slavery, that is decreasing your amount of people who are there to work, which is going to hinder their economic development. Politically, the borders that were created by these European nations did not match up with where people lived tribally. So you would have tribes that would be separated, you have other ones that would be put together, and now they have to be in the same country and get along, and that was an issue. So those artificial borders put in place by Europeans created conflict, much like what we saw leading into Hotel Rwanda, right? And they were also affected culturally. The imperializing of Europe led to what is called the westernization. So remember, that's not like cowboy western, it's Western Europe, the United States, that kind of area, and it took away traditional African culture. We see a lot of Christianity in sub-Saharan Africa. A lot of that is due to the imperialism by the Europeans. All right, another thing to talk about economically is nomadic herding. A nomad is somebody who moves around with their, well, just a nomad is just somebody who moves around. Nomadic herding is when you're raising animals and moving them around in search of water and food. Again, water is so vital in desert areas that it even changes the way people make money. And so people will move with their herds to find resources. Desertification is when the desert increases. So the desert in sub-Saharan Africa, or the desert in Africa, is growing. What's happening is in that transition zone, the Sahel, if you look at your physical geography map, the Sahel is turning more and more into a desert. So what's happening is you see overgrazing of crops, or overgrazing of animals, and more crops that are being planted in areas that can't support it. We have widespread drought at times, and not moving crop rotations around so that you're overusing the soil. That helps it, that keeps it from having resources. And then with wind erosion and those kind of things, the deserts are actually growing. You can't get that arable land back once it's gone. So desertification is a big problem that's happening within the southern part of the Sahara into the transition zone in the Sahel, which is impacting their economy. All right, so let's talk about infrastructure real quick. So remember that infrastructure is anything that makes your economy work. So things like roads, bridges, running water, electricity. Having those things does not make you money, but if you don't have them, it's going to be hard to own a business. It's going to be hard to be able to produce product. So generally speaking, if we're talking about Africa's infrastructure, it's poor. There is that lack of infrastructure. They do have highway systems, but they're not as extensive as ours are here in the United States. There's a lack of money, a lack of entrepreneurs. There are low populations in a lot of areas. But then there's high population in other places, but there's not enough resources to meet the needs of the people. We don't have electricity in a lot of these places or running water, so people are still spending a majority of their time collecting those things for basic daily life and are not able to develop economically. All right, how would you describe Africa's standard of living? All right, so let's look at this map again. If you're listening, go ahead and look down at the screen. This map that's at the bottom is the Human Development Index. So they're looking at lots of different factors that plays into how developed the country is. So here we see the bluer the color, the more developed they are. So we see places like the US, Western Europe, Japan, Australia, and then the places with the lower population the lower Human Development Index, the lower HDI, is going to be in the oranges and red, and look where most of them are, sub-Saharan Africa. That lack of money because of the resources being taken during imperialism is a major part of that. Widespread disease and famine have also contributed to that as well. So some of the poorest nations in the world are located in Africa. Going right along with that, we would also say Africa's level of development is less developed compared to the rest of the world. We saw that with the high birth rate. Remember our population pyramid from earlier? We also, you need to be able to interpret demographics and be able to look at those. So we'll talk through those here at the bottom of the screen. Literacy rate is the amount of people who can read and write. That is low in sub-Saharan Africa. The life expectancy tends to be lower, maybe 10 to 15 years less than ours is. GDP per capita is low. The countries as a whole are not making a lot of goods and services to be sold because people are just surviving. The infant mortality rate is high in some countries. The infant mortality rate is as high as 10% of babies dying in their first year or two of preventable diseases. The poverty rate is high and the population growth is high. Those things contribute to sub-Saharan Africa being less developed. All right, so on our African economics notes, we talked about ecotourism in Africa, and the major way we see ecotourism in Africa is the safari tours. It does, what safari tours do well is that it keeps the local people, possibly those people who would either poach the animals and kill them themselves and sell them, or be guides for poachers to show them where they're at so that poachers can go and, for instance, sell elephant ivory or animal skins. Instead of doing that, when you build in ecotourism or safari tours, those guides who know the land, who know the animals, can now point wealthier people towards where those animals are located. So instead of killing the animals, you are preserving their life and also having a way to make money for the people that is positive. So it's income for the community, it protects the nature and resources. All right, so I think it's easy for us to think, well, the United States was colonized and so was Africa. What was so different that the United States is one of the most developed countries in the world, but Africa as a whole and all of those countries are are struggling a lot. Let's talk about the differences between colonization. So in the United States, when we gained our independence from England, colonists stayed. They did not leave and go away and take their resources. They were staying. Lives had already been established. Schools, universities, businesses. So people stayed. Whereas in Africa, when these countries gained their independence, the colonizing powers left. They did not stay. They left Africa to fend for itself. In the United States, they'd also built and had more access to resources. There were more roads and bridges built. There were more schools built. Some of those things were done in Africa, but most of the infrastructure was leading specifically to the resources. So you would see a train track going from the coastline into the rainforest to get the resources and then move them out. It was not built to connect villages and to help the whole country develop as a whole. It was built to get the resources out. That's another situation. Again, even though the United States had resources taken from it by England, it was not done in the same way. We also saw more education in the United States where there was less in Africa. Some education was happening through missionary work and through the churches, but there was also the conversion to Christianity, and things were different. The way the schooling was done was westernized, and it was just different than what was on the continent before. So that left the United States more developed where Africa was less developed. Despite everything that we've been talking about over the last couple of minutes, Africa is developing economically. When you have an increasing of young people, that also means that 15, 20 years down the road when they look for jobs, there's more workers, right? So you have the opportunity for economic growth if you can sustain it, right? So as we've seen the native peoples taking back control of their countries, we see the slow improvement of their economies. Look at this rate of GDP growth, and this is from 2008, you can see that since most of the independence movements happened in the 1960s, we can see that economic growth through the GDP, right? And it's increasing pretty dramatically, and you can see that Africa has one of the biggest growth rates of anywhere in the world, even higher than the world average and higher than developed economies. We see Africa is growing much more. And so we will tend to see over the next 15, 20 years, we'll see even more economic growth in Africa. All right, so now we're going to talk about some of our current events throughout the region. And the first thing was Sudan and the genocide in Darfur. I think Darfur. I think some of these numbers are wrong on your review sheet. I apologize. But we see so genocide is when you kill a certain group of people. This was done mostly to the Christian and the animist people in the south. And so we see large amounts of refugees leaving. So in the Lost Boys of Sudan, we see the boys leaving because they were orphaned and their lives were in danger. They go to refugee camps, mostly in Kenya, and then they leave the United States for an opportunity for education and for jobs. The cultural differences that they saw when they moved to the United States was technology, the different interactions socially, where they feel like they don't have time to make friends or to interact with one another, and how much they have to work to get by is just not what they were expecting. Looking at our current events notes, we talked about Sierra Leone. And Sierra Leone is where we have the blood diamonds, right? So these diamonds are also called conflict diamonds. They're mined using forced labor, and that money earned went to support invading armies and rebel groups. So unknowingly, many more developed nations that were buying these diamonds were funding these wars in Africa. Okay, next up we have HIV and AIDS. So HIV and AIDS is probably one of the biggest issues that's impacting Africa to this day. We see somewhere between 15 to 30% of our most southernmost points of Africa having HIV and AIDS. It's killed millions of people. It is not a disease with a cure. And the lack of medical facilities, the lack of medical education has caused issues. And if everyone is sick with HIV and AIDS in your country, how can you develop economically? Most people with HIV and AIDS live in Africa, something I think like 60%. Even though there is medicine now to prolong the lives, there's still no cure. We also talked about apartheid in South Africa. I think this one's number 19. I'll change that on here. So apartheid was the legal segregation between races in South Africa. This is specific to South Africa, and there were very strict rules, even where people were supposed to live, that were black South Africans, giving more resources and more rights to the white South Africans. Nelson Mandela fought against this. He was imprisoned, and then after 25 plus years in prison, he became the first black president of South Africa when he was released from jail. Next up, we have Boko Haram. Boko Haram is taking place, is a terrorist group in Nigeria. You've probably seen the hashtag Bring Back Our Girls, which you see right here. And what's happened is this terrorist group is literally called Western Education is Forbidden. So not wanting to westernize their country, they want to stay in this fundamentalist Islamic group. They kidnapped girls who were going to westernized schools that were not Muslim schools, and they kept them for a long time, some of them being quote converted to Islam and marrying into the terrorist group. But it continues to be an issue. They are connected with Al-Qaeda and Al-Shabaab, and this is probably one of the more prevalent terrorist groups in Africa at this time. All right, so here's a list of some of the mapping that you will need to know. I think your review sheet says that there will be 8 mappings, so here's a couple more. So go ahead and pause for a minute so you can write down some notes about all these. We have talked about most of them already in the review, but take a minute to make quick notes next to your map right now. All right, so I have corrected the map on this screen so that way it matches up with your orange review sheet. Please make sure you know these physical features: the Sahara, the Sahel, the Nile River, Lake Victoria, Serengeti Plains, Congo Basin, and the Kalahari Desert. Additionally, these are 5 countries that you need to know about. These are ones that we talked about with our current events. In other important countries, we looked at Egypt, the Nile River, Sudan being where we have Darfur genocide and where the Lost Boys are from, Sierra Leone from the blood conflict diamonds, Nigeria, location of Boko Haram, and South Africa, where apartheid was ended with Nelson Mandela. Alright guys, so make sure you study for your test, and come talk to one of your teachers if you have any questions. Have a good day.